Stop scrolling. Stay with me for 60 seconds, because what I'm about to explain sounds bold, decisive, even patriotic, but it collapses the moment you look at the system underneath it. President Trump says the U.S. government could reimburse American oil companies to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure. He says it could be up and running in under 18 months. That claim feels powerful. It feels fast. It feels like control. But systems don't care about slogans. Oil experts aren't debating months. They're talking about a decade. They're talking about hundreds of billions, possibly $1 trillion. And they're talking about oil that does not belong to the United States. Here's the deeper question you should be asking. If this plan is so profitable, so obvious, so easy, why don't the oil companies want it? Because this isn't about energy. It's about illusion, risk, and political time colliding with economic reality. Stay with me. Once you see the structure behind this idea, you'll never hear it the same way again and next. We need to define what is actually being proposed, stripped of the noise. Let's slow this down and remove the theater, because clarity is where power actually lives. What is being suggested is not a minor policy tweak. It's a radical shift in who carries risk and who absorbs loss. The idea is that American taxpayers would effectively underwrite the resurrection of a foreign oil system, one damaged by years of mismanagement, sanctions, and political instability, on the promise that it will somehow pay for itself later. That promise rests on three assumptions. First, that oil infrastructure can be rebuilt on a political timetable. Second, that global oil markets are hungry for new supply. And third, that private companies are eager to return to a country where assets were seized and contracts ignored. Each assumption collapses under scrutiny. This is not a question of optimism versus pessimism. It's a question of incentives, memory, and market structure. Governments can announce plans overnight. Economies respond over decades. And if you want to understand why this proposal sounds simple but is structurally unsound, we have to step back away from today's headlines and look at how Venezuela's oil story actually reached this point. To understand why this idea keeps resurfacing, you have to understand Venezuela's oil history as a lesson in time horizons colliding. For decades, Venezuela sat on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. On paper, it looked like an endless prize. In reality, it was a slow-moving trap. Heavy crude, aging infrastructure, enormous capital requirements, and a political system that remembered profits far more vividly than contracts. Years ago, U.S. oil companies entered Venezuela with optimism and spreadsheets. Then came expropriations. Assets were seized, billions were written off. Legal victories in international tribunals were won and never paid. That memory matters. Oil is not just geology. It is trust, continuity, and rules that survive elections. Once those rules break, capital does not rush back. It withdraws, recalculates, and waits. Meanwhile, Venezuela's infrastructure decayed, wells corroded, refineries failed, skilled workers left. What remained was not a switch you could flip, but a system that would require years of rebuilding before a single barrel mattered. And this is where today's proposal collides with reality, because history does not reset just because politics demands a headline. Here is where the first rupture appears quietly, but decisively. President Trump suggests that U.S. oil companies could rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure quickly and that the government might reimburse them if needed. The number isn't specified, but anyone who understands oil knows the scale immediately. This is not tens of billions. This is hundreds of billions, possibly $1 trillion absorbed before meaningful output appears. And notice what's happening beneath the surface. The same administration that still enforces sanctions is floating a plan that assumes political stability. The same country that expropriated foreign assets is suddenly treated as a reliable long-term partner. And the same oil executives who were burned once are expected to forget. That contradiction is the crisis. Because capital does not follow speeches. It follows risk-adjusted return. And in this case, the risks are sovereign, legal, geopolitical, and irreversible. You don't lose a refinery the way you lose a quarter. Once it's gone, it's gone. So the government dangles reimbursement public money to neutralize private fear. That alone should stop you. If the plan were economically sound, it wouldn't need taxpayer insurance. And when government starts socializing risk to manufacture enthusiasm, it tells you something fundamental is broken. This is not confidence. It's compensation for distrust. And that takes us directly to the mechanism hiding underneath this proposal. This isn't an energy strategy. It's a confidence theater designed to look like momentum. The reimbursement talk exists because the market signal is negative. There is a global oil glut. Prices are hovering far below the level that triggers large, irreversible investment. Rigs are down. Layoffs are up. Even companies still present in Venezuela are shrinking, not expanding. In that environment, no rational executive commits billions to a decade-long rebuild in a politically unstable country unless someone else absorbs the risk. That someone is the public. So the mechanism is simple and dangerous. Privatize the narrative, socialize the losses. If it works, politicians claim credit. If it fails, taxpayers carry the bill. And because the timeline stretches far beyond any single administration, accountability dissolves. This is why the idea keeps being repeated, despite expert disbelief. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates the illusion of plausibility. That's how unsound proposals survive long enough to distract, but distraction has limits. Because while leaders debate hypothetical oil flows, the real world keeps moving. Prices keep signaling. Workers keep losing jobs. And that tension produces a second, sharper crisis, one you can't explain away with slogans. Now, the second crisis emerges, and this one is louder, sharper, and harder to ignore. While this proposal talks about rebuilding oil fields abroad, the oil industry at home is already pulling back. Rigs are coming offline. Layoffs are spreading. Companies are cutting workforces because prices are too low to justify new drilling. At $57, $58 a barrel, the math simply doesn't work. Serious investment usually waits for 75 or higher. This is the contradiction at the heart of the plan. If Venezuelan oil were somehow brought online quickly, it would push prices even lower. That might sound good at the gas pump, but it would hit U.S. producers first. Domestic drillers would suffer. Jobs would disappear faster. Communities built around energy would feel it immediately. So ask yourself, who actually benefits? Not workers. Not companies already struggling to stay profitable, not taxpayers underwriting risk. The only short-term gain is political messaging, the appearance of action without the substance of stability. This is how policy becomes performance. The promise sounds bold, but the outcome undermines the very industry it claims to strengthen. And when these contradictions reach ordinary people, when jobs vanish and costs rise, the conversation stops being abstract. It becomes personal. That's where we have to go next. This is where the story stops being theoretical and starts touching you. When oil companies pull back, it's not executives who feel it first. It's workers. It's families. It's towns built around rigs, refineries, and supply chains that suddenly go quiet. Jobs disappear long before any hypothetical Venezuelan oil ever reaches the market. And here's the cruel irony. If prices fall far enough to make this plan look successful, U.S. drillers suffer even more. Lower prices mean fewer investments, deeper layoffs, and shrinking local economies. The promise of cheaper fuel comes at the cost of long-term insecurity. Meanwhile, taxpayers are told they may have to subsidize foreign infrastructure, billions of dollars, while healthcare costs rise, housing becomes less affordable, and wages struggle to keep up. That trade-off is rarely stated clearly, but you live with it every day. You are being asked to carry risk you didn't create for benefits you may never see. If this analysis helps you see the system more clearly, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. These decisions shape lives, not just headlines. And once you understand the personal cost, you can see why the impact doesn't stop at America's borders. It ripples outward. What happens here doesn't stay here, because oil is a global system, not a national one. Venezuela's fields don't exist in isolation. They sit inside a crowded, competitive market shaped by OPEC decisions, Saudi production strategies, and expanding output from Russia and China. Every barrel introduced anywhere changes incentives everywhere. That's why timing matters more than slogans. Right now, the world is not short on oil. It's saturated. When supply outpaces demand, prices fall. And when prices fall, instability spreads, especially in countries that rely heavily on energy exports to fund their governments. So a rushed return to Venezuelan oil wouldn't just pressure U.S. producers. It would reshape global alignments. OPEC members would respond. Production wars would intensify. Marginal producers would suffer first. Political tensions would follow economic stress. At the same time, sanctions, regime continuity, and legal uncertainty don't disappear because one leader declares victory. Capital flows where rules are predictable. When they aren't, power fills the vacuum. This is how economic miscalculations become geopolitical ones. And once global systems are in motion, they don't reverse easily. That's why the most important question isn't what happens next year, but what kind of future this logic produces if it's allowed to harden. That brings us to the fork in the road. From here, the system splits into three possible futures, and none of them depend on rhetoric. They depend on structure. The best case scenario is restraint. The proposal remains mostly symbolic. Oil companies stay cautious. Markets continue to signal reality. No massive public subsidies are committed, and the idea fades quietly as attention moves elsewhere. Damage is limited because illusion never hardens into policy. The middle scenario is confusion. Partial commitments are made. Legal frameworks blur. Small sums are spent chasing momentum. Nothing decisive happens, but uncertainty increases. Investors hesitate. Workers feel instability. Trust erodes slowly, not with a crash, but with a grind. The worst-case scenario is escalation. Public money is pledged to cover private risk, contracts stretch beyond political terms, a future administration inherits obligations it never chose. Prices fall further, domestic producers suffer. And when the project inevitably stalls, accountability dissolves into finger-pointing. This is how systems fail, not through malice, but through misaligned timelines and incentives. The lesson is simple and uncomfortable. You cannot solve structural problems with performative solutions. Markets punish denial. History remembers broken rules. And economies move at the speed of reality, not ambition. What happens next depends on whether decision makers listen to systems or try once more to shout over them. And that brings us to the final insight. Let me leave you with the core insight, because it applies far beyond Venezuela. When leaders confuse visibility with viability, societies pay the difference. Big promises feel decisive. Complex systems are not. Oil markets, legal regimes, and human trust don't bend to political will. They respond to incentives, memory, and time. This proposal was never really about oil. It was about control of the narrative, about sounding strong in a world that no longer responds to strength alone. But strength without structure becomes spectacle. And spectacle, sooner or later, collapses under its own weight. If you want real energy security, real prosperity, real stability, you don't get there by socializing risk and privatizing hope. You get there by aligning policy with reality, even when reality is inconvenient. That's the choice in front of us. If this analysis sharpened how you see power, economics, and the stories you're being told, stay with this channel. Share this video with someone who still thinks these decisions are abstract. They're not. In the next video, I want to go deeper into how distraction politics works, why it keeps succeeding, and how citizens can recognize it before it shapes their future. I'm Jeffrey Sachs. And understanding the system is the first step toward changing it.